Hello and welcome to the Mayview Stein podcast, a podcast dedicated to the elaboration and expression of human oneness, to reminding us that despite our outward and apparent differences, at the essential level we are all one. A podcast dedicated to the exploration, edification, and nurture of the human mind and to uncovering the inestimable potentials which are latent therein when properly and intelligently harnessed. And lastly, a podcast which aims to remind us that before any outward changes can occur in our apparent and phenomenal world, they must occur within ourselves. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Today we'll be discussing and elaborating upon what I would like here to call the detriments of factionalism, or put another way, the ill of partisanship. But before we commence, it will be of use, in my estimation, to clarify the terms in question. By factionalism, therefore, I intend to refer to the subdivision of human persons according to political, racial, religious, or various other ideological and or conceptual lines. In turn, the term partisanship may be identified as identification or association with some or another established party and or faction. And lastly, by faction, a term which, for the purposes of today's discussion, we may use interchangeably with party, we may understand. And here I'd like to take the personal liberty of referring to the Merriam-Webster's definition, a party or group, as within a government, that is often contentious or self-seeking. And with this latter explication is where I'd like personally to begin. As previously stated, when consulting the definition provided to us by the indubitably reputable Merriam-Webster's dictionary, we discover in our consultation that, in relation to the term faction, it is stated that one of the qualities attributable thereto includes the being, quote, often contentious or self-seeking, close quote. And the principal reason why it is my intention to commence with this particular Merriam-Webster's analysis of the term faction, that is because, as the theme of our discussion today suggests, we will be looking at and analyzing what I have heretofore termed the detriments of factionalism. Now, what precisely are these aforesaid detriments of factionalism? Well, as Merriam-Webster's analysis has already so concisely revealed for us, they involve the being often contentious and self-seeking. Now, allow me to ask you this. Have you ever wondered why there exists so much conflict in our world today between peoples? Have you ever wondered why, when analyzing the historical record, we find incalculable instances of the same? Has, out of curiosity, the question ever occurred to you as to why it seems that humanity, both contemporarily and historically, seems so incapable of coming together to achieve global peace and global harmony? Well, the reason for this, and one need not be a rocket scientist to comprehend this, as it is, I believe, self-evident, is the institution and the sustaining of the phenomenon of factionalism. But the question with which I'd like to begin here, and taking it for the moment for granted, that the contentious and self-seeking nature of factionalism, as Merriam-Webster has so eloquently and revealingly characterized for us, is inherently problematic and an indubitable hindrance to the institution of global peace and global harmony, is the question of the origins of the institution of factionalism, or in other words, what precisely is it which gives rise to the institution of factionalism in the first place? Is factionalism an inescapable aspect not only of the nature of man, but of nature as such? In other words, is the phenomenon of factionalism as intrinsic to the operations and proceedings of the natural universe as are the motions of the planets, as is the formation of galaxies, or as the particular interactions of atoms and molecules happen to be? Is factionalism something which man can do away with, in the same way that he can do away with the invariable physical laws which govern the activities of the physical cosmos? That is to say, not at all. Here I'd like to cite, if you'd be so kind as to allow me, the proclamations attributed to the late 19th, early 20th century Russian philosopher and mystic G.I. Gurdjieff. In his book, In Search of the Miraculous, the Russian esotericist P.T. Uspensky, who for a period of time studied under Gurdjieff, and whose aforesaid work was meant to be an exposition of the Gurdjieff teachings, asserted that, in relation to what we may call the possibilities of man, Gurdjieff taught that, quote, man's possibilities are very great. You cannot conceive even a shadow of what man is capable of attaining, close quote. Now, of course, this strikes one as possessing a sort of inspirational or motivational air. Indeed, Gurdjieff is here declaring, as per Ouspensky's account, that the possibilities of man are very great. However, Gurdjieff subsequently then appends to this declaration the following, quote, "But nothing can be attained in sleep," close quote. Now, of course, anyone who has delved and who has dug into the work and teachings of Gurdjieff will have indubitably come across the Gurdjieffian idea of being asleep. But number one, what is meant by this latter idea of being asleep? And number two, what relation does it bear to the theme of our discussion? To answer the first, it will be useful again to cite Gurdjieff, and again I'll be referencing Ouspensky's account as expounded in his In Search of the Miraculous. As per Ouspensky's account, therefore, we find Gurdjieff declaring, in relation to this concept of being asleep, that what we colloquially identify as the waking state, that is, the state of consciousness which we enter when we arise out of bed in the morning, and the state in which we remain until we fall physically back asleep at night, or at any other point during the day if we are prone to naps, for example, or in other words, the state in which we perform our ordinary everyday functions and activities. In short, the very state in which presumably you are now as you listen to this recording is in fact, for Gurdjieff, just another state of sleep. But how? How can this be? How can a man who is obviously awake and who is performing some function, say going to his job, preparing his dinner, going out for a jog at his local park, or listening to this podcast, how can such a man performing such customary activities be said to be asleep? Wouldn't we, if we encountered a man going out for a jog or who was having a conversation with a colleague, identify such a man as being awake? Perhaps we might, but not Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff of such a man would declare that he is asleep. But in what sense is he asleep? Well, here's where I'd like to cite again Gurdjieff for the purposes of clarification. In his In Search of the Miraculous, Ouspensky tells us that Gurdjieff taught that, quote, "There is nothing new in the idea of sleep. People have been told almost since the creation of the world that they are asleep, and that they must awaken. How many times is it said in the Gospels, for instance, 'Awake, watch, sleep not'? Christ's disciples even slept when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane for the last time. It is all there. But do men understand it? Men take it simply as a form of speech, as an expression, as a metaphor. They completely fail to understand that it must be taken literally. And it is easy to understand why. In order to understand this literally, it is necessary to awaken a little, or at least to try to awaken." Close quote. Gurdjieff then goes on to say the following, quote, "So long as a man sleeps profoundly and is wholly immersed in dreams, he cannot even think about the fact that he is asleep. If he were to think that he was asleep, he would wake up. So, everything goes on, and men have not the slightest idea what they are losing because of this sleep. As he is organized, that is, being such as nature has created him, man can be a self-conscious being. Such he is created and such he is born. But he is born among sleeping people, and of course he falls asleep among them, just at the very time when he should have begun to be conscious of himself. Everything has a hand in this, the involuntary imitation of older people on the part of the child, voluntary and involuntary suggestion, and what is called education. Every attempt to awaken on the child's part is instantly stopped. This is inevitable, and a great many efforts and a great deal of help are necessary in order to awaken later, when thousands of sleep-compelling habits have been accumulated. And this very seldom happens. In most cases, a man, when still a child, already loses the possibility of awakening. He lives in sleep all his life, and he dies in sleep." Close quote. Gurdjieff, in essence, is saying that the average man and woman live their lives in a state of sleep. But as we've seen, this isn't a reference to the colloquial variant of sleep, by which we mean, if I may cite again the Merriam-Webster's dictionary definition, quote, "The natural, easily reversible periodic state of many living things that is marked by the absence of wakefulness and by the loss of consciousness of one's surroundings, is accompanied by atypical body posture, such as lying down with the eyes closed. The occurrence of dreaming and changes in brain activity and physiological functioning is made up of cycles of non-REM sleep and REM sleep, and is usually considered essential to the restoration and recovery of vital bodily and mental functions." Close quote. Now, however, Gurdjieff's account of the term sleep goes beyond this, but to what degree does it go? In other words, for Gurdjieff, what would constitute the difference between being asleep and being awake? In today's modern Western culture, we find popularly reference to the idea of being woke. But what does it mean in popular culture to be woke? Well, if we consult Merriam-Webster's dictionary again, we find that to be woke refers to a sense of being, quote, aware of and actively attentive to important facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice, close quote. Very admirable upon first sight, wouldn't you agree? I think so. However, if we refer to the teachings of Gurdjieff, we will find that under his categorization, those who in our modern popular culture identify as being woke are amongst the deepest in sleep. Well, how so? Well, what does it mean in Gurdjieff's philosophy to be asleep? It's difficult to summarize, but we do have some hints. Previously, when citing Ouspensky's account of Gurdjieff, we found that, quote, as he is organized, that is, being such as nature has created him, man can be a self-conscious being. Such he is created, and such he is born, close quote. However, immediately after, if you'll recall, Gurdjieff adds the following, quote, but he is born among sleeping people, close quote. What does it mean to be born among sleeping people? Well, in order to understand this, we have to understand what Gurdjieff precisely means by being asleep. For Gurdjieff, to be asleep means, if I can take the liberty of summarizing his teaching here, simply to conform to the structure of one's environment, or in short, to assimilate. For example, let's say that a person X, let's call him, is born into a type of society which, whether explicitly or implicitly, matters not in this case, for the point nevertheless remains. Let's say that this person X, is born into a type of society which encourages, let's say, that its members wear their hair a certain way, or practice a certain religion, or adopt a particular form or pattern of manners or behavior. And let's say that this person X, growing up and being educated in such a society, therefore, subsequently adopts unconsciously being the key word here, the particular hairstyle, religion, or behavior in question. Of such a person, that is, of person X, to the degree that he conforms to and adopts, in obedient fashion, whether the hairstyle, religion, or behavior, or indeed whatever other ideology or form of mannerism encouraged to him by his social environment, Gurdjieff would say that he is asleep. Now, why? Well, because depending upon the social environment into which he happened to be born, or exposed to, his personality will be determined and molded. That is, by being exposed to a particular social environment, such a person is being subconsciously programmed, conditioned, and psychologically molded. Now, as I've said before, the key word here is subconsciously or unconsciously. Again, if I can take the liberty of summarizing the Gurdjieffian teaching, what actually distinguishes being asleep from being awake, again in the particular context of the Gurdjieffian philosophical system, is in a word, consciousness. But in what sense are we using the word consciousness here? When you are walking down the street, are you consciously aware of the sensation of the texture of your shoes as experienced by the skin of your feet? Probably not. Instead, you're probably paying attention to something else in the environment. For example, maybe you're paying attention to an oncoming pedestrian, so as to avoid accidentally bumping into him. Or perhaps you've just experienced a bad breakup, and your thoughts concerning the breakup are now occupying your conscious attention as you walk. There are a lot of things, even during our colloquially speaking waking state, of which we are entirely unconscious. For example, are you presently aware of the sensation of the tightness of the waistband of your pants as it's wrapped around your waist? Presuming you are at the present moment actually wearing pants, that is. Is the waistband of your pants, in other words, assuming you are wearing pants, comparatively tight or comparatively loose? And were you directly, consciously aware of this prior to my bringing it up? In other words, prior to my bringing it up, were you in your mind consciously thinking something along the lines of, the waistband of my pants is of such and such a tightness around my waist? Something tells me that you weren't. I suspect you were too busy, hopefully, with paying attention to the content of the podcast, and therefore to the sound of my voice, that consequently you failed to take direct conscious notice of whether your pants are comparatively more tighter or looser fitting as they extend around your waist. Again, assuming you actually are wearing pants. Now, not only the degree of the comparative tightness or looseness of the waistband of your pants as it extends around your waist, but a myriad of countless other things are things of which we are from moment to moment, at any given time, entirely unconscious. The waistband of your pants, and whether it happens to be more loose or more tight around your waist, is but one example of the innumerable things of which we simply are unconscious at any given moment. Now, what does any of this have to do with the theme of our discussion today? That is, with the theme of the detriments of factionalism. Well, in order to really address this latter question, I want to return again to the question of what is factionalism? Factionalism, as we've established previously, refers to the subdivision of human persons according to political, racial, religious, or various other ideological and/or conceptual lines. And just for the sake of context and fullness of expression, let us remember too that partisanship refers to the identification or association with some or another established party and/or faction. Now, if you'll recall, concerning the issue of factionalism, I raised a series of questions, which here I'll take the liberty of repeating, namely questions concerning the origins of the institution of factionalism, or in other words, what precisely is it which gives rise to the institution of factionalism in the first place? If you'll recall, we also asked, is factionalism an inescapable aspect, not only of the nature of man, but of nature as such? Or in other words, is the phenomenon of factionalism as intrinsic to the operations and proceedings of the natural universe as are the motions of the planets, as is the formation of galaxies, or as the particular interactions of atoms and molecules happen to be? We asked, in short, is factionalism something which man can do away with in the same way that he can do away with the invariable physical laws which govern the activities of the physical cosmos, which is to say, not at all. Now, if you'll recall, in response to these questions, I took the liberty of referring to the philosophical teachings of Gurdjieff concerning his particular concept of being asleep, and as I've said, any person acquainted with the Gurdjieffian system will grasp what is meant by his particular usage of the term sleep, which of course varies, as we've said, from the colloquial. Now, to summarize, I'd like briefly to restate again, for the sake of fullness of expression, the Gurdjieffian idea of being asleep. In Gurdjieff's view, any person can be categorized as being asleep if he lives his life in a way such that he does nothing other than merely conform to his cultural environment. In other words, according to the Gurdjieffian system and philosophy, one who, because he's been programmed and because he's been deeply psychologically conditioned to assimilate to and to adopt the particular mannerisms and/or ideologies of a particular culture and/or social group, a fact of which, incidentally, he might happen to be, and at least according to Gurdjieff, more than likely is unaware, because it happens to occur so subtly and so casually, just outside the register of his conscious mind, as, for example, the tightness of one's pants around one's waist is typically just outside the register of one's conscious mind. For Gurdjieff, such a person would be classifiable as asleep because he acts and behaves merely only according to how he's been programmed, to how he's been conditioned, and to how he's been indoctrinated by the social and/or cultural environment into which fate just so happened to place him. And in truth, this is how a lot of us live our lives. The fact is that just about everything that we do throughout the course of any ordinary given day, whether it be go to our job, dress in a particular fashion, hold a particular ideology, engage in a particular action, etc., 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 is typically the product of nothing other than, wait for it, conformity and/or assimilation to environmental pressures. Gurdjieff describes those as asleep, who do nothing other than conform to such pressures, who live their lives in such a way that they merely assimilate to the standards and expectations of their cultural and/or social environment. Such people are asleep, says Gurdjieff, mere unconscious automatons, marionettes without any semblance of conscious autonomy. And in fact, the whole purpose of the Gurdjieffian system, or work as he called it, was and is the deliverance from this unconscious assimilation which characterizes the general public. But a discussion of the Gurdjieffian work will lead us too far astray relative to our theme, and hence will be further discussed in a future episode. For now, suffice it to say that the whole purpose and aim of the Gurdjieffian work is to enable the student to gain mastery over himself and how he lives his life, to snap him out of the hypnosis to which his social and cultural environment has subjected him since the very moment of his birth. In short, to enable him through self-reflection and self-analysis to become directly consciously aware of the fact that he is an autonomous, conscious being, and not merely some mindless and unconscious cog in the social, cultural machine, as hitherto he's been. Now, remember, we are, as Gurdjieff declares, born among sleeping people, which is to say, everyone all around us is in a state of hypnosis, in entire unconscious assimilation to the cultural social environment into which they happened to be born. And when we are born, we simply are incorporated into the whole unconscious program, until before we know it, we're old and decrepit, and we realize that although we were born into the world, not once did we actually live freely. All we ever did was conform, and conform. Obey, and obey. But I digress. What is factionalism, and can man possibly liberate himself from it? Or is he just as much incapable of escaping it as the planet is of escaping the laws of gravitation? I hope that the reason why hitherto I've been discussing the Gurdjieffian concept of being asleep has dawned on you, and if it hasn't, please allow me to explain why I have. You see, we live in a world today in which the masses of people, that is, the general public, are born into a particular cultural social environment, and depending upon the nature and structure of that particular cultural social environment, their habits, opinions, and minds will be accordingly molded and conditioned. As in his book, by the title of Propaganda, the Austrian-American public relations pioneer Edward Bernays, who incidentally was named one of the 100 most influential Americans of the 20th century by Life magazine, for what that's worth, and who also incidentally was nephew to the well-known Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud, again for what that's worth, declared, again in his book Propaganda, that, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." Close quote. And what do we have here? Well, we have an exposition by one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century, according to Life magazine, of the actual nature of the way that our society actually functions, which Gurdjieff himself would have deemed an accurate assessment. In fact, elsewhere in Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, Gurdjieff is said to have declared that, quote, "There are 1,000 things which prevent a man from awakening." And in order to act consciously with the intention of awakening, it is necessary to know the nature of the forces which keep man in a state of sleep. First of all, it must be realized that the sleep in which man exists is not normal, but hypnotic sleep. Man is hypnotized, and this hypnotic state is continually maintained and strengthened in him. Close quote. Then, as per Ouspensky, Gurdjieff goes on to declare, just about mirroring the sentiment expressed by Bernays in the above propaganda citation, that, quote, "One would think that there are forces for whom it is useful and profitable to keep man in a hypnotic state and prevent him from seeing the truth and understanding his position." Close quote. Again, I ask, can man possibly liberate himself from what in my view is the disease of factionalism? Or is he just as much incapable of escaping it as the planet is of escaping the laws of gravitation? Well, I want to point to yet another Gurdjieffian quote, this time one of his most comparatively well-known utterances, namely that, quote, "What is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses." Close quote. Now, this is actually a rather big deal and is actually very, very important and significantly pertinent to our topic. But how? Well, you'll have to forgive me, but please allow me to reference yet another Gurdjieff quotation, taken again from Ouspensky's account in his In Search of the Miraculous, and which, in my estimation, just so accurately, I mean to an absolute T, sums up the condition of our modern world, and in which this time Gurdjieff refers to the concept of knowledge, saying that, quote, "The crowd neither wants nor seeks knowledge, and the leaders of the crowd, in their own interests, try to strengthen its fear and dislike of everything new and unknown. The slavery in which mankind lives is based upon this fear. It is even difficult to imagine all the horror of this slavery. We do not understand what people are losing, but in order to understand the cause of this slavery, it is enough to see how people live, what constitutes the aim of their existence, the object of their desires, passions, and aspirations, of what they think, of what they talk, what they serve, and what they worship. Consider what the cultured humanity of our time spends money on, what commands the highest price, where the biggest crowds are. If we think for a moment about these questions, it becomes clear that humanity as it is now, with the interests it lives by, cannot expect to have anything different from what it has." Close quote. Gurdjieff is saying that the masses of people are so profoundly asleep, so profoundly assimilated into the cultural program, that for them the question of attaining genuine self-autonomy doesn't even begin to arise. Everything about how we think is determined, and to again cite Bernays, quote, "dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, by those who pull the wires which control the public mind." Close quote. We're entering some very, very deep territory here. But of course, it's what we ought to expect when addressing an issue as profound and as intricate as the nature of the mechanism of the public mind, and incidentally, of public conduct, which includes but is not limited to that phenomenon characterized by the appellation factionalism. Now, in what sense, to repeat Gurdjieff's earlier cited declaration, is it the case that what is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses? Or in other words, when Gurdjieff declares that what is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses, what exactly is he asserting? Well, let's go back to his declaration concerning the theme of knowledge. What do we mean here by the usage of the term knowledge? In other words, in what sense are we using the term here? Well, we've already said it, and for the sake of clarity, I'll here take the liberty of repeating it. Namely, and to use Gurdjieff's own words, we mean by the term knowledge to refer to that knowledge of the absolutely profound fact that, quote, "as he is organized, that is, being such as nature has created him, man can be a self-conscious being. Such he is created, and such he is born." Close quote. Now, to any person even a fraction of the way awake, that is to say, to any person who has even some semblance of awareness of the fact that he and the public live lives entirely conditioned, the statement that man can be a self-conscious being will be of significantly great weight, and in turn, to the degree that one gradually, through a sheer effort of conscious will, snaps out of that deep, profound, and hypnotic sleep which is imposed upon him by his social cultural environment, then the more consequently that the weight of that statement will proportionally grow. But remember, Gurdjieff concludes the aforementioned statement with the assessment that, nevertheless, we are, quote, "born among sleeping people, and, of course, fall asleep among them, just at the very time when we should have begun to be conscious of ourselves." Close quote. Now, during our early years, during our formative years, that is, when we first begin to develop a sense of conscious awareness of our own existence, immediately we are indoctrinated. At home, our parents or guardians tell us what is appropriate behavior and what is not. At school, our mind is developed along certain lines, and in the overall social environment, we are conditioned for our life to come so that without a fault, we beautifully conform to the social structure a conformity which will last our whole life long and which will follow us to our grave. Incidentally, there exists a spoken word record by the name of The Strangest Secret, one which, if I may be a little candid here, I've listened to approximately over 100 million times over the course of the past several years, and indeed many times on repeat throughout the course of an ordinary day, as part of my ordinary daily listening routine, and which I play on loop as I sleep. Yes, I know, just a tad slightly obsessive, but please consider not judging me here. Now, the record, very easily accessible on YouTube for those of you who are interested in giving it a listen, was written and narrated by the 20th century American radio announcer and author Earl Nightingale, and opens with the following remark. Quote, "Not long ago, Albert Schweitzer, the great doctor and Nobel Prize winner, was being interviewed in London, and a reporter asked him, 'Doctor, what's wrong with men today?' The great doctor was silent a moment, and then he said, 'Men simply don't think.'" Close quote. Men simply don't think. Now, later in the recording, Nightingale goes on to say that, quote, "Rollo, the distinguished psychiatrist, wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Himself, and in this book he says, the opposite of courage in our society is not cowardice, it is conformity, and there you have the trouble today. It is conformity, people acting like everyone else without knowing why, without knowing where they're going." Close quote. Now, The Strangest Secret, for context, was published in 1956, a fact which will be relevant to the following quote, which is also taken from Nightingale's The Strangest Secret, in which Nightingale declares that, quote, "In America right now there are over 18 million people, 65 years of age and older, and most of them are broke. They're dependent on someone else for life's necessities. Now we learn to read by the time we're 7. We learn to make a living by the time we're 25. Usually by that time we're not only making a living, we're supporting a family. And yet, by the time we're 65, we haven't learned how to become financially independent in the richest land that has ever been known. Why? We conform." Close quote. Now again, this is from 1956. Now, as to why it is the case that so many conform, Nightingale declares that, quote, "Well, they really don't know. These people believe that their lives are shaped by circumstances, by things that happen to them, by exterior forces. They're outer-directed people." Close quote. Then, following this, Nightingale goes on to point out that, quote, "A survey was made one time that covered a lot of men, working men, and these men were asked, 'Why do you work? Why do you get up in the morning?' 19 out of 20 had no idea. If you ask them, they will say, 'Well, everyone goes to work in the morning, and that's the reason they do it, because everyone else is doing it.'" Close quote. Now, why, in a discussion intended to concern itself with the topic of the detriments of factionalism, are we referencing a work, namely Earl Nightingale's The Strangest Secret, which concerns itself not at all with the theme of factionalism? Well, because one of the central themes in Nightingale's The Strangest Secret, namely the theme of conformity, plays a very, and I do mean very significant and critical role in what we identify as the phenomenon of factionalism. In fact, I will go so far as to say that factionalism is exclusively a phenomenon characterized by a mindless conformity to the pressures of outward environment. Factionalism is exclusively a phenomenon characterized by a mindless conformity to the pressures of outward environment. And it's not much else. Besides, of course, being literally a venom which serves only to fracture our species and prevents us from obtaining even a semblance of global harmony or global peace. It is factionalism which is preventing us from establishing a better world for ourselves and for our children. Our kids will grow up in a torn and divided world simply because we cannot break the mindless conformity, because we continue to be manipulated by what Bernays identified as the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. Here I want to revisit Gurdjieff again. Do you remember when we pointed out that Gurdjieff declared that, mirroring Bernays' sentiment in Propaganda, quote, "The crowd neither wants nor seeks knowledge, and the leaders of the crowd, in their own interests, try to strengthen its fear and dislike of everything new and unknown." Close quote. Well, immediately after this, in reference to this fear, If you'll recall, Gurdjieff added that quote, "The slavery in which mankind lives is based upon this fear," close quote. We are marionettes. We are puppets, and as such, all we do is merely play, perfectly, if I might add, our role as pawns on the chessboard of human gullibility. We believe that every time we go out on the streets to march for some cause, defending some faction of ours, that we are performing some positive and constructive act for the sake of human advancement. And what's worse, many times our demonstrations are violent, and they even turn into unruly riots. But we don't see our folly. No, we continue, like complete and utter fools, to believe that somehow dividing ourselves apart and arguing back and forth against each other's tiny little petty factionalistic ideologies, and worse, even physically destroying and burning down our own communities and cities via unruly riots. We continue to believe that by doing all of this, somehow we're establishing a more harmonious and peaceful world. Now that I think of it, it's no wonder why Gurdjieff declared that we're asleep. Now, any man or woman who genuinely believes that humanity can come together in perfect solidarity and make genuine progress in our world by the institution and sustaining of the phenomenon of factionalism, I think would be something worse than asleep, if I can be a little honest here, but that's just me. You see, we live in a world today in which a community of self-identified woke individuals aim to establish a more harmonious world by continuing to set themselves apart from and oppose another group of individuals which, from the perspective of these so-called woke, are not woke. Now, this is obviously nothing other than a joke, but beyond this, it is a tragedy, a genuine tragedy. It is a tragedy that we live in a world today in which people continue to believe that somehow the Tower of Peace and of Harmony can be constructed with the bricks of division and conflict. It is a tragedy that we live in a world today in which one's personal factionalistic identifications matter more to him than the establishment of peace between peoples. And it is a tragedy that we live in a world today in which we consider someone else a sort of rival simply because he holds a different ideological position relative to our own, practices a different religion from the one which we do, or if we're non-religious, then we simply just oppose ourselves to those who are. It is a tragedy that we continue to divide ourselves from another simply because he happens to be of a different skin color, or is a member of a particular profession which we've been indoctrinated to oppose, or is in some other sense just different. At the opening of this episode, when describing the nature of this podcast, I declared that this podcast is a podcast dedicated to the exploration and expression of human oneness, to reminding us that despite our outward and apparent differences, at the essential level we are all one. And this is indeed what I intend to do and what I intend to dedicate myself to. In addition, of course, to my two other established aims, which I also pointed out during the introduction, namely to focus on the exploration, edification, and nurture of the human mind, and on the uncovering of the inestimable potentials which are latent therein when properly and intelligently harnessed, and also, and this is perhaps most important of all, to remind us that before any outward changes can occur in our apparent and phenomenal world, they must occur within ourselves. Now, tragically, however, we live in a world today in which so many of us demand to see less hatred, whilst continuing ourselves to hate. We live in a world today in which so many of us demand to see an increase of compassion and of understanding, whilst continuing ourselves to lack that compassion and that understanding. Yes, we live in a world today in which we criticize the faults of others, yet we fail to see those of our own, and it's all to do with, you guessed it, factionalism. Factionalism is what blinds us. It's what keeps us blind to the fact that deep down we are all one. Yes, factionalism is the plague which keeps us separate and prevents us from beholding the fact that yes, we're all one. It's a malady which poisons and destroys the mind. Factionalism is the chain which binds us to division and which keeps us from the heights of peace, of union, harmony, and of oneness. We live in a world today in which we cannot find the peace and the harmony which we seek amongst peoples because we wear, and unfortunately very proudly, the blinders of division, of faction, and of party. Why is it that today and throughout history humanity has always been engulfed by conflict, by strife, and by discord? Because of nothing else besides factionalism. You see, we're so attached, each of us it seems, to our party or our faction, that we fail to see that those whom we label as somehow different are in fact not so. No, they're human beings just like you and me. But it is factionalism which robs us of this vision of our oneness, which robs us indeed of our humanity. It is factionalism which sustains our discord and division. It is factionalism which is the wall between ourselves and peace, compassion, harmony, and the fact of our inherent oneness. And yet, we don't see this. We continue to divide ourselves. We continue to build taller and yet taller that wall of factional attachment. What are the detriments of factionalism? They are the blindness they impose on us. They are the hindrance which prevents and makes impossible the realization of peacefulness and harmony amongst people, and they are the barriers which partition us from the knowledge of our essential and inherent human oneness. And worse, they are that dense and nebulous fog which clouds our faculty of comprehension. Look, for example, at the institution of journalism. Oh, to what deep depths has this institution so tragically descended? Journalism is worse than a joke today. It is an institution which ideally is designed to be objective and impartial, but which is today so far removed from this that now all that there's left of it are mere bones and withering ashes, nothing but a corpse which rots with every brand new day. Now, if I may take the liberty of being somewhat candid here, and since we're on the topic of how factions rot what we call, I'd say undeservedly, the modern institution of so-called journalism, recently in my personal daily journal, yes, I practice journaling, I consider it to be one of the best practices that anyone can perform for self-development, but I digress. In my journal, I wrote a passage which I think here will not be wholly out of place. I wrote namely that, quote, I'm curious if there still exists objective journalism in the world today, viz., journalism which leans neither right nor left but towards the facts. If such objective journalism actually does exist, chances are the public wouldn't be aware of it at all. Why? Because the general public, I've found, doesn't too much care for objective facts. Rather, the general public is far more interested in the reinforcement of personal political ideologies. You see, our world is divided into right and left. All the while, as we pursue the reinforcement of subjective political ideologies, whether towards the right or towards the left, matters necessarily not, the facts and the objective truth continue to elude us. Yes, partisanship is a disease which rots the mind and corrupts one's capacity to properly reason, and unfortunately our world is currently being absolutely ravaged by this categorically disgusting disease, close quote. Partisanship, factionalism, is a disease. It is the plague which continues to prevent the realization of our intrinsic and inherent human oneness. Now, I do not ask, I think I ought be clear here, that you abandon your positions nor cease to identify with whatever it is that you believe. In other words, I don't ask that we abandon factions, since frankly I don't think we can, since remember, and as Gurdjieff said, what is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses. However, what I do here ask is that, as an individual, you stop demanding that the world improve and rather work on your improvement. I ask that you do not demand the world become more peaceful, but that you yourself learn to be so. I ask that you do not demand the world abolish hatred. I ask that you abolish it from within yourself. Indeed, I ask that you do not demand a better world. I ask that you yourself be that very betterment you wish to see. You see, we like to believe that somehow the world can improve without we ourselves improving. We like to believe that somehow our world can come together as one human family. Yet we continue ourselves to maintain divisions, and we foolishly like to believe that somehow we make our world a better place without ourselves first becoming so. It was Mahatma Gandhi who reminded us that, quote, "We but mirror the world. All the tendencies present in the outer world are to be found in the world of our body. If we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change. As a man changes his own nature, so does the attitude of the world change towards him. This is the divine mystery supreme. A wonderful thing it is, and the source of our happiness." Close quote. And it was the Stoic Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius who uttered that, quote, "Whenever you are about to find a fault with someone, ask yourself the following question: what fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize?" Close quote. And also in his Sermon on the Mount, Christ reminded us that, quote, "Judge not, that ye be not judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. And with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, Let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye." Close quote. It seems that so many of us are so intent on pulling out the mote within the eyes of others, yet simply fail to see the overwhelming beam within our own. And it's all because, that's right, you guessed it, because of factionalism. Maybe it's true, as Gurdjieff says, that what is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses. And maybe it's true that as a species we are destined simply to remain asleep, hypnotized into conflict, turmoil, and an unending and ceaseless factional division. But what is not true is that we as individuals cannot grow, because we can. What is not true is that we as individuals cannot learn to once and for all do away with hatred, because we can. And what is not true is that we as individuals cannot learn to recognize consciously the oneness which we all share, because, again, we can. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, reminded us that, quote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Close quote. Now, so many of us make every effort, it seems, to try to improve our world, to speak out against hatred, and to remove motes from countless eyes. Yet all the while we make no effort to make those improvements within ourselves. All the while we make no efforts to vanquish hatred from our own hearts, and all the while we make no effort to remove the beam which blinds our sight and clouds our vision. Maybe what is possible for individual man is impossible for the masses. But supposing this to be true, it doesn't therefore follow from this that we cannot, as individuals, be better human beings, renouncing all hatred, recognizing the inherent oneness which we all share, and learning to become one point of light in a world darkened by the shadows of division, partisanship, and factionalism. My friend, ask not that the world be better. Be yourself better. Ask not that hatred be abolished from our planet. Abolish it from within yourself. And ask not that there be peace within our world, but rather be yourself that very source of peace. And lastly, and to conclude this episode, and as Marcus Aurelius reminded us in his famous Meditations, quote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be, and be one." Close quote. My name is Felipe Mayviewstein, and thank you for joining me on this episode of the Mayviewstein Podcast.